Welcome to the sixth and final round of the USU University's Debating Championship. Congrats on making it this far. I don't know what the alternative is, but something people say. I'm Isaac. You have no opportunity for recourse in this round. If I wrong you, I can judge you with impunity, as there are no feedback forms. But that said, I'm a good judge. You'll be fine. So welcome. Let me figure out who's speaking first, and we'll get started. So Claremont, Ellen, or Adrian? Cool. And Cornell? Cornell? John. And Alaska?
Brett.
Wonderful. Does anyone have, by any chance, any questions before we begin?
Is this open or education?
Yes.
Oh.
So, yes.
That's
Open.
the worst one.
Yeah.
Just tell it to the street.
Open education.
Yeah. Open education. Yeah. All right. Let's get started. Just wondering if you mind keeping time, please. Cool. If I do it, it's going to go badly. Wonderful. All right. With that, I'd like to invite Ellen up to open the case for her side.
We on side opposition believe that the status of war, especially particularly war from Western liberal democracies towards other nations, and often non-democratic Western nations, has critically changed in the last several decades. We think that this critical change has basically taken the form of hyper-securitization, retributive war, and actually not even war in its most foundational concept, right? We don't declare war, we simply engage in conflicts. And in the times that we do declare war, we have war on concepts, war on terror, war on drugs, right? The types of war and conflict we engage in are foundationally different. For those reasons, we stand in proposition of the motion, and I think that we're just going to have a very general and wide-sweeping model, right? We think that we understand that attack drones are, in this particular context, are going to be drones that are not operated by actual human beings, but are operated by, by the technology that they possess, and that also that the West is going to be Western liberal democracies. Beyond that, counterinsurgency is basically just going to be any insurgency in a conflict, which means obviously we're not really in a war on Iraq, but that in that conflict, this would count in this circumstance, right? So I'm going to make 2 points today. The first one is basically what my introduction alluded to, that we live in a status of hyper-securitization and in a context where the West goes to war on huge concepts like terror. The second one is going to be that the depersonalization of warfare is going to lead to the perpetuation of warfare. No, not this time. So on the first point, right, we think that we have to vitally consider the context of the round that we're engaging in. And the context is that the United States engages often in war in a retributive way, right? You attack us, so we're going to attack you back. And we think additionally, the United States attacks people basically on broad concepts, right? We attack them because they engage in terrorism. We attack them or attack their political structure because, like in the case of Colombia, right, they engage in drug deals. We also have, smaller scale attacks against entire governments because we disagree with their governmental philosophy. We think that these examples exist in plethoras where we attempt to take down leaders that we don't agree with. Leaders that don't, I'll take your point in 1 second. Leaders that don't agree with the democratic philosophy. We think this is hugely problematic for the way war actually occurs. But before I continue,
Are drones causally responsible for any of these? Aren't every
I'm laying out the context of war as it exists, and my second point is going to talk about the depersonalization of warfare. But I think it's really important to talk about the fact that we are actively engaging in wide-sweeping operations. And I think that what this does, and the link in, right, is that it justifies all kinds of warfare in this hyper-securitization context. One example is that we started privatizing our military, right? We're engaged in all of these conflicts, so we can't physically actually have the capacity to do what we need to do. And as a result, we privatize our military. Another example, I think an obvious example for this round, is that we, at one point, engaged in getting nuclear arms, right? We have all of these, we have all of these excuses to get basically weapons, to amass security personnel, and we don't actually consider at the time of those acquisitions whether or not those things are moral and whether or not those things are right? So this moves me to the second point, which is that the depersonalization of warfare is in fact a bad thing. We think it's bad morally, and we also think it's bad pragmatically because it perpetuates war. No, not at this time, right? So when you have these attack drones that are not operated by people, that can take out targeted positions on counterinsurgencies, we think that these tend and do replace troops on the ground, right? These replace the people who we send to war. And we think that it is an empirical fact that when we replace the people who we send into war, we replace basically our mind's eye on that war. We no longer actually consider deeply the impact that war has on us, because we don't really know any, a huge segment of the population doesn't know people who are engaged in the conflict, doesn't know people who are in the military, and don't actually feel the burden of the war on their actions. Right? I think that, and this is kind of a side claim, but as an empirical fact, that during the Iraq War, the fact that we actually lowered taxes 2 times is unprecedented and demonstrates the fact that people don't actually feel the effect emotionally or on their pocketbooks, right? We're in war, engaged in conflict, at this time, and we're lowering taxes. That just shows you the emotional disconnect between the general populace of the United States and the wars that they're engaged in, right? So we think that there are 2 specific impacts that result from this. The first one, right, is a philosophical one, which is the fact that we no longer actually morally consider or make calculi based on the impact to other people. So insofar as you face very, very few burdens on your personal self to engage in that war, you discount the other people, the insurgents, if you will, but also the people who live in that nation, the people actually affected by war, the people who their economies are drastically, obviously going to suffer, because insofar as you're engaged in war, like the Iraqis are, your economies are in uncertain territory, and there's no investment in that country. Right? So we think this vastly underplays the impact on other groups, the insurgents who are attacking, not at this time. We think also, though, that this more pragmatically leads to a perpetuation of war, because insofar as it's easy to access war as a medium of solving conflict, insofar as it's easy to just say, well, we have these drones, they're highly capable of attacking individual targets, and they don't actually require any human life on our part, we think it's extremely easy to engage in that conflict. We think that this is actually pretty empirically proven, right? Because you can go back to the example of the privatization of the military, which we're going to argue is also kind of a morally bad thing without check. Or we think similarly that nuclear arms, I think, can be argued, obviously in a separate debate, that this also allows for power without check, power that we don't actually feel the impact of. So in today's debate, I think that the evaluation or the framework you have to operate under is basically you're evaluating whether morally these objects, which is hard to do, right? Morally these objects lead to moral calculations or not. And we think that these lead to inferior moral calculations on the part of the people that operate them. And we think additionally that this leads to empirically increased war and increased conflict, which is only at the expense of alternative means of negotiating, at the expense of economic sanctions, at the expense of actual international relations in the way we want it to play out in international forums. And so for those reasons, we strongly urge you to propose. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Ellen. And whenever you're ready, Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, I personally don't like war. I don't think a lot of us like war. But the fact is, sometimes threats exist to particular countries outside of their own sovereign territories, and sometimes it's necessary for them to take measures to eradicate these threats. And we're going to show to you comprehensively that drones are indeed the best way to do this. They're the way to do this with the least number of civilian casualties, with the least amount of actually civilian collateral. But even if there is civilian collateral, it pains us to say this, but it is the best form of civilian collateral for us to actually have to incur. But before that, some direct refutation, right? So, first of all, they said that there's going to be a culture of retribution. That having drones and using drones makes us a retributive people. And when you asked in the POI, what exactly is the evidence to show that possessing these weapons and using them actually makes us more jingoistic and more aggressive? Is there a causal link? And they fail to really establish one. Simply because you possess a particular kind of weapon that you exercise as a tool with extreme reluctance does not mean that it makes you go into places and act in ways that you wouldn't have otherwise done. The manner in which, thank you, the Americans have used drones is in places where using troops would have been too expensive materially and strategically. we don't invent wars simply to put our drones to good use. And this is something the side government really has to show us. In fact, it's instructive, no thank you, that the places we've been using drones are places where we've earlier tried actual physical intervention. For instance, in places like Pakistan, for instance, on the border with Afghanistan, in places like Somalia, remember Black Hawk Down. Remember, for instance, sending covert operations into Latin America to deal with the drug lords. We simply have not invented any wars. And then they say that, look, depersonalization is bad, and we shouldn't be replacing troops on the ground. Well, again, we don't think that this is necessarily the case. We don't think that you can simply say, no thank you, simply because you're not using people, you're going to be careless, or you're actually going to extend wars longer than necessary. This simply isn't true. First of all, it isn't actually true that we don't know what's happening, and Reddy's going to talk more about this. There are agencies like the New America Foundation that actually maintain a precise log of every drone strike that's ever been carried out with the amount of civilian collateral actually associated with this. Again, there is no sort of causal link. There is no evidence to show that this depersonalization is actually bad. In fact, and I think Reddy's going to talk more about this, we think it leads to a more rational response on the part of the Americans, knowing that their own men aren't in line. They don't act with so much brute force because they don't have to protect their own citizens. There's an element of impersonalism that we think is actually good. And then this argument about the Iraq war and like reduced taxes or something as an example. Well, as far as I remember, we used troops in the Iraq war. We sent in lots of troops, we sent in lots of tanks, we sent in lots of bombs, and we used airplanes that generally had a very high radius of attack. We think that perhaps a singular drone strike to Saddam Hussein's compound might have actually been better. So first of all, why are extraterritorial threats sometimes existing in such a manner that necessitates the use of drones, right? We think that, first of all, they often exist in territories that have governments that are hostile to the US, which means we cannot actually send in special ops to sort of do the dirty work, right? We think sometimes it's simply impossible. But even in cases where the country is an ally, the problem is, if you look at all the examples, drones are being used in places where the reach of even that state actually does not extend. We're talking about places like North Waziristan in Pakistan, where Pakistan as a government has basically ceded its own control, where it's basically said that you guys can have your own system of law. This is almost a microcosmic civil war within that country. No thank you. If you look at Somalia again, while Somalia is basically not a country today, there isn't an ally that we can actually use, which means that we have to go in, which means that there is no other option but to actually use military force. And I want to tell you why exactly it is, and we think that this particular form of military force is actually the best, right? We think, first of all, the question of collateral damage, right? We think that it kills less people. There's evidence to show that as drone technology has actually improved, we're having less misses, we're having less sort of unnecessary kills on the outside. I'll take you at the end of this point. That's absolutely crucial to remember that this is not a debate about acting or not acting. It's a comparative debate about weighing the required tools that we actually have.
Great. So given the fact these areas are so far out of the way and so far out of the reach of power and conflict, wouldn't it be fair to say that they'll quickly fall back into the hands of insurgents once the drone strike is over?
Sure, okay, fine. So if in a particular case the insurgents might actually come back, is no reason to try not to get rid of them in the first place, especially if we know that the alternative to this is not the domestic state actually strengthening and taking control of that area. If there was evidence to show, for instance, that the Somalis are on the verge of basically like creating a state that can then sustainably attack these insurgents, we might have a different opinion, but that's not the case. That's neither the case in Pakistan, where Pakistan is conceding its own control in these territories. There's no other alternative. It's up to you to actually show me why exactly it is that drones are unnecessary, and I don't think you're going to do that. So, okay, I also want to emphasize the nature of counterinsurgency, because I think that it's actually particularly important over here. Because the way these things actually work is that these insurgents, by definition, are those individuals who like to hide among the population, right? Who like to sort of meld into the population and really make it difficult for other people to actually attack them. And we think that this is particularly problematic and necessitates, no thank you, the use of drones. Because when this is the case, we need to have two goals in mind. One, of course, is to minimize collateral damage, which we think that statistically drones off late are actually doing. We think that therefore you should be using drones and not people, right? But secondly, we think even if collateral damage has to occur, and this is what I mentioned at the top of my speech, we think it's important, as brutal as it sounds, for the Americans not to be associated with that collateral damage. Because what that actually does is that it allows these extremist groups, for instance, the ones that actually foster these insurgencies, to use that as propaganda tools. For instance, when you send in American troops instead of using drones, and they end up going on killing sprees, as we recently saw in Afghanistan, it is tremendously detrimental to the interests of not just the US, but also the domestic government, which is seen as allowing in these troops to come in and commit all these atrocities, which are often actually tremendously atrocious sometimes. Therefore, if you're using drones and a few people die, and accountability is actually hard to pinpoint, we're fine with saying that that's actually better because it's harder to show, it's harder to use as a propaganda tool. Mr. Speaker, the use of ground forces is incredibly messy. It leaves a very large footprint. We don't think that actually should be your choice of weapon, if you will. The last thing that I want to briefly mention is that we actually think it leads to a more rational response on the part of the people who are operating the drones. Because we think that the cost-benefit calculus that goes into the minds of American military planners when they're actually using troops is far more severe. This is precisely the reason when, for instance, when we went in after Osama bin Laden using SEALs, we sent in like 3 backup helicopters. They ended up blowing a helicopter up, inside the compound. It's these kind of extreme reactions that actually occur because the top thing on your mind all the time is we need to get our men out of there. Because this mentality actually doesn't exist, we think it leads to more rational responses. Was a necessary, this is the least messy way to do it, let's do it.
All right, thanks very much, Victor. And with that, Adrian, whenever you're ready.
Mr. Speaker, I think there are 2 kind of fundamental drops coming out of the last speaker's speech about the framework Ellen gives you about the over-securitization and kind of this retributive defense mechanism that Western liberal democracies have increasingly defaulted into in the last 10, 20, even 30 years when they kind of conceptualize ideas of terror or drugs as the things they fight versus actual people or, governments, or governments become placebos for these concepts. And second of all, when Ellen comes up and tells you very, very strategically, which they kind of don't answer at all, that what drones do is they remove rationality and responsibility from wartime situations, and because of the link into the current framework of the way that war works and operates in the status quo, drones are inherently harmful and they decrease all of the things that opposition would like you to come up here and believe. Now on to some rebuttal, which actually kind of interweaves a continuation of the case and a reassertion of the case because I don't think they quite grasped it. First is this idea of the security mindset. And they kind of get up here and say, well, you can't just say that retribution exists and so drones shouldn't exist. And what we're saying is that when you have an increase in securitization, you have this kind of increase, if you make me feel threatened, not if you actually do something to me, but if the premise that your government stands on, the premise that your constituencies stand on, if they make me feel threatened, I have a right to promote whatever sense of government, democracy that I see fit. And at the point where that arrangement exists in the status quo, at the point where it's not a tool of reluctance, like they want you to believe. This idea of securitization, democracy promotion, kind of forced transitional democracies in these states where we have interceded, in places where Western liberal democracies have interceded, in places like Iraq, in places like Afghanistan, I think is really, really bad to start a precedent when you look at this current status of war and how, in the last couple years, Petraeus has also acknowledged this several times, there have been new technological innovations and a willingness to end war for the cost of human lives. And that has led to an increase and a bite into this securitization and the willingness to use technology. But furthermore, in this idea of the investment of war, we should not engage in wars where we are unwilling to take a vested stance of human life and economic capital. And that is a huge, huge deal. Because when it comes down to war, what we're going to say is that the wages of war on human populations and on strategic on-the-ground observations will always be prioritized. And this kind of directly refutes their entire positive matter here, where they say that troops basically decrease rationality and decrease responsibility. We say that's not true. We see that at the point where Personalization already creates ill will in countries where there is occupation. A depersonalization with attacks of people who are perceived as figureheads of insurgent groups within those countries will be bad. At the point where we say, we are so willing to occupy your country and create a human toll against your population that we'll even remove ourselves from the process and put our drone in to take out your leaders or what have you for people that the populations within these nations support, it's really bad. And you have a huge backlash for the United States, and you have a huge backlash for other Western liberal democracies who come up and make the claim that it is okay for us to, kind of attack your ideals, attack your standards, and attack your belief systems, and we're not even going to do it ourselves. We're going to send in a machine to do it. And the message that sends is that the cause that we are fighting isn't even that important to us because we're not willing to invest our capital in it. We're willing to kind of do this quick and dirty hands thing, because if you want to argue that Western intervention in Somalia was effective, that's like the biggest joke I've ever heard. And furthermore, I would say that at the point where you have rationality that does occur on the ground. You have rationality when U.S. discussions of Iraq are already very limited. U.S. discussions of places where we have occupation, where we have insurgencies happening, and where the U.S. has to face insurgencies are already limited at the point where we prioritize humans over machines. At the point where we take machines and we use them to prioritize humans, you once again decrease the calculus, decrease rationality, because you limit the information and the exposure already on the ground.
When an insurgent group exists in another country that doesn't get rid of that group itself, how would you deal with that threat if you don't use drones?
Okay, first off, I think there's a couple things. One is this idea of Western powers should not use drones, and that's kind of dropped from them. They're kind of just supporting the idea of drones in the abstract, right? That in countries where there's people living in the mountains, but also blending into the populace, which kind of doesn't make sense. Like, they're kind of moving their target of where people actually are, where drones are being hit, and why it's so hard to get there. I mean, you can make the argument that Osama bin Laden, right, was blending into the populace and was a figure that we could identify who was hard to find, but humans can still find him. And at the point where all of Ellen's information stands unrefuted, that there is an inherent link between the understanding of war and the inclusion of humans in a conflict, we will always have to prefer. But even then, they're advocating for the use of drones in the abstract. They're not considering the unique, and this gets into my positive matter, they're not considering the unique instances where when Western powers enact drones in situations where there are isolated people who they're trying to find. And here's some really big reasons why that's bad. First off, security of these nations. In 2006, Petraeus came out and said that when forces fail to provide security or threaten the security of civilians, basically what happens is that the population is likely to seek guarantees from insurgents, militias, or other armed groups. And this situation can lead to support for insurgents. So the idea that they're trying to promote here, what they're kind of fundamentally ignoring, is by supporting drones in the abstract, you support them in cases where they can be abused. And at the point where forces are not providing security, that you don't have understanding on the ground, when you kind of substitute the idea of a drone, you have this kind of idea where real insurgents are happening, like they're not being co-opted and they're not being prevented. But furthermore, we have few metrics to understand the scope of casualties and wartime externalities. WikiLeaks is the closest we've gotten to understanding the idea of insurgencies in the last 10 years even. So the idea of numbers, of actually who's involved, where they're involved, where casualties are being held, where the real power cells are being held. We have understanding from American soldiers trickling down to civilian populations, which then leads to the pressure of political and military people who are in positions to make decisions. And this is all directly influenced by Western powers who operate a lot of the kind of weight in the Middle East and other places where you see a lot of conflict happening, understanding mortality figures, refugee numbers, displacement. And at the point where you kind of metaphorically replace the machine and say that the point where we have the really serious thing that we want to get done, the person that we want to eradicate from the Western perspective, not just this kind of decontextualized idea of supporting drones in general. We're saying Western powers specifically should not, because Western powers have historically proven that they do not understand the situation on the ground. And for those reasons, we proudly urge you to propose.
Cool. All right, thanks very much. All right, now I'd like to invite Ready to finish the debate for the top half, please.
There's something odd about two non-Americans having to defend American drone strikes, but Kirat and I, in the least facetious sense, truly do believe that drone strikes are exactly what Kirat told you they were. The least messy option to take care of a messy job that needs to be done, if indeed both sides acknowledge that the insurgent threat is a real thing. We don't think First Government really did challenge that. We think that what they told you was that engaging in costly and destructive wars was a bad thing, a position Kirat and I don't intend to challenge and that we don't think will be an object of controversy in this debate. A little bit of refutation before I develop two additional points. First, I'm going to take First Gov on exactly what they think this debate is about and talk to you about just war theory and why exactly this preserves tenets of it. Then I'm going to talk to you about why the insurgent threat is important and how exactly controlling it is important, responding then to what I think John might talk about because his POI said, oh, what if insurgents just pop up? Kirat and I are going to tell you why drones make it less likely that that happens. Before that, refutation. Three things we heard. First, this really eerie rhetoric about attacking belief systems that are antithetical to yours. Kirat and I are not about to pass a value judgment as to whether America really is defending a freedom agenda or anything of that sort. It may be, it may not be, but we don't think that the question of drones ultimately turns on that. The way we know that is because the largest military intervention started before the widespread use of drones, whereby drones were largely in the developmental phase. The way we further know that is because the intensification of drone usage, particularly during Obama's presidency, is contemporary with a decrease in the number of military interventions and actually an increased hesitancy to go into wars. So we don't think this is a debate about whether America should intervene in wars. We think it's a debate about how it should engage in wars. Which brings us to the other concern they had, which they called, in a very odd manner, hyper-securitization and war in a retributive manner. I'd like to hear, if Second Government also believes in this, how exactly the usage of drones is retributive, because I don't think it is, right? We think it is indeed acutely preventive and preventive in at least a potentially surgical manner, right? But furthermore, the question we want to ask is, if they believe drones are depersonalized objects, can they give us a conceptualization of war without these depersonalized objects? Kirat and I contend, and I don't think it's going to be controversial, that war happens anyway with depersonalized objects. We don't think that a tank is any more personalized than a drone is. We don't think a large airplane putting down bombs with what Kirat told you did have larger blast radii is indeed any more depersonalized rather than drones are. We do not think that a meaningful distinction exists between warfare as it would be conducted without drones, i.e. the warfare of 10 years ago versus the warfare of 1 year ago. We furthermore think that increasingly, the age we live in is a world in which the world is increasingly watching. What does this mean? Side government has this logic that the only potential check from atrocity could be if a soldier, fearing his own life, keeps his weapon in check because he's afraid that other people might take his own life. We recognize that this is a potential check, but we don't think it's a particularly good check, and I'm going to tell you why this might actually make soldiers overcompensate and use violence much more if their own life was in danger. But furthermore, we think other checks do exist, right? Kirat gave you the example of the New American Foundation documenting every single drone strike that happens. The way I know this is because I spent part of my spring break helping a 70-year-old professor research what she calls the dark side of the Obama presidency. We think what I found in that research, and what is well documented actually, is that despite Obama's quadrupling of the usage of drone strikes, the number of drone casualties who are civilians has actually decreased compared to the Bush years prior to that. What this means is that the experimentalist drone phase has transitioned to a different drone phase which actually has more surgical capacities, thus making drones perhaps a better surgical option, something that we'd really want further government contention from. Furthermore, they give you this idea that there is like no notion of human loss involved in this. Again, I've already told you that nothing since really like trench warfare or kamikaze bombings has there been like this symmetric risk of a human life. So on to the two new things I want to say. Just war theory. Something that the government is exceedingly concerned with is this notion of waging war a moral way. We agree, but we think your moral starting point is not always the protection, or rather not always the preservation of an equal playing field, if indeed wars ever were about equal playing field. Here then I put to you the perhaps controversial view that wars indeed are about de-equalizing the playing field and ensuring that you do have an unfair advantage on that playing field, right? But we do agree that certain minima must be achieved, right? And we think that those certain minima actually do start with the protection of your own troops first. We think that there is a moral reason for this because these individuals have indeed granted their lives as protectorates of your nation, and hence you as a nation have a reciprocal moral obligation to preserve their lives. But even if you don't find that plausible, we do think there's a pragmatic justification in that, because evidence all the way from Vietnam shows you that when individuals fear their own life at risk, something that these guys tell you through their own argumentation that drone strikes does not have, because indeed you are controlling a drone from far away, is that individuals don't overcompensate. This overcompensation they might mock, but in Vietnam, this overcompensation looked like burning entire villages down. In Iraq, this looked like gunning down civilians, quite simply out of the suspicion that they might carry out attacks. It's not entirely different, I'll take first off in a second, not entirely different from the Trayvon case you just heard. Go ahead.
You're conflating the people we're talking about. The people that First Proposition is talking about are the people back home who are making calculations about whether or not to send people into war.
Okay.
Our Proposition
Fantastic. I would find your argument a lot more plausible if, since the increase of drone usage, we have been more permissive to wars. We actually have not. In fact, you've heard wider both public, popular, as well as political sentiment railing against interventions in wars like Libya, where insurgency has been a valid issue. We furthermore think that protecting your own interests under just war theory is not exactly incompatible with civilian protection. Kiran gave you excellent analysis, and this is actually factually true, that the usage of drones is most common in places like northern Waziristan, parts of Somalia, whereby the usage of drones is necessitated because the state's reach doesn't extend far enough, and correspondingly the infrastructure needed to physically put your own troops there, and perhaps the risk of putting your own troops there is commensurately high, that makes it very hard to pursue these alternatives and necessitating drones. We think that in such situations the only way civilians can expect protection from insurgents, if indeed you buy somehow that insurgents are something to be protected against, is indeed in this manner. Quite quickly on the insurgent threat and how to control it, we think that the self-regenerating logic of insurgency is always with the notion of the invading Westerner, the guy with a gun you can physically see shooting other people around you. We think that when that logic is absent, when that logic becomes one of drone strikes, whereby you do indeed have an increased surgical capacity, whereby your civilians aren't killed in that larger blast radar I told you about, whereby someone isn't indiscriminately shooting at you because he fears for his own life, we think that is a situation whereby people feel more safe and are less likely to be converted to radical insurgent cause. We say that that is a better way to deal with the problem that is grave and that is real and that Kirat and I want to solve.
Cool. Thanks very much. And now to open the second half of the debate, I would invite John to speak.
Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm going to be doing for you in my speech today is telling you specifically why drone use is messy, as opening opposition seems to think it's not. And I'm going to do that in 3 ways. And basically, our team line is that we not only want to fight wars, but we want to be able to fight just wars, and our side makes fighting those just wars easier. And I'm going to tell you that in 3 ways. First of all, using drones makes fighting makes the fighting on the ground more violent and more destructive against Western forces. Second of all, fighting terrorism with terrorism is a generally bad and counterproductive idea. And third of all, this idea of decreased costs and how that affects the war in general. But before I go into that, I have a few main points of clarification and moving forward. So first of all, Reddy comes up here and tells you that overreactions are less likely to occur. We have a couple responses to this. First of all, we think when people are allowed to make a cold, calculated decision about when to kill someone from far, far away, they are far more likely to say it's okay to kill this number of people more than it is when in the heat of the battle, and they can see a child soldier on the ground and choose to arrest rather than to kill him. We think that machines can't capture, but humans can. So that's one thing. Second of all, he talks about preventive measures. And we think that taking preventative violence is particularly bad when we are in the moral stand. We believe that the West is a moral arbiter and needs to have a moral powerhouse. And we think preventative is bad for a couple of reasons. First of all, drone strikes don't replace soldiers. They don't replace bombers. They replace soldiers in physical action as opening government brought to you and was not repealed by Backhound. We also think that they brought this idea about Obama decreasing the attacks on civilians. We think this is not because drones have become safer, but rather the conflicts have become more compressed. Okay, just a couple more points of rebuttal. First of all, we think that drones are only offensive, unlike soldiers which can also play a defensive role. Like, my soldiers can guard you from violence, whereas drones cannot. Drones can only go out and kill, which is why we think they have a particularly bad optic, and which comes into play later on in my speech. Okay, last point. Kira, no, I'm not giving you more time to talk about your case. So we think that it's like Kirat comes up here and tells you, oh, we'd only go into places where it's impractical. We think this is bad for a couple of reasons. First of all, we don't think it solves the problem because, as I brought up in my POI, they'll just retake the territory if we can't bring in troops to secure it, so you're just attacking people indiscriminately, and you're killing civilians for no apparent reason. Second of all, we think that if people, it makes it more easy for us to violate sovereignty, as we did with Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. We think when you don't have to put people in and you can only send a drone in under the radar and attack people, we think it makes it easier for Western states to violate sovereignty, which we think is particularly bad because it hurts our moral legitimacy in the long run. Okay, now I'm going to go into my substantive method. My first idea is why this makes fighting on the ground more difficult. The optics of a technologically advanced civilization attacking rebels and insurgents who may have public support with a machine that has no face and no credibility is particularly bad. Imagine if you were sitting in this building and a plane just randomly, like a drone flew by and just blew you up. We think this is particularly bad because it creates a David and Goliath mentality, where you have people who are living in a technologically unadvanced society being bombed by people with a drone, being bound by a drone who doesn't have this. We saw this happen when we used a Black Hawk chopper fired on civilians in Iraq. We see this happening when civilians are killed by materially advanced technology. Now, if you argue that bombers are bad and have the same consequence, we think you probably shouldn't use bombers either. We think a major component of the war against terror and the war against insurgency is winning hearts and minds. And we think that this is counterproductive to the idea of winning hearts and minds because drones fire indiscriminately. They can't choose to not kill children, they can't choose to not kill women, and they can't choose to not kill people who are non-combatants and medics. And the problem is where you send these drones into are usually complexes. You're not targeting one individual, you're targeting a complex where you could send troops in who could make on-the-ground determination. No! Okay, second of all, it foments anti-West sentiments out of the current conflict. We need to look simply past where we are today and look to where we are in the future. And the problem with using technologically advanced weapons against a technologically unadvanced civilian is that it makes us look like we are the bad guys. We are the ones who are radically oppressing a people simply because we don't agree with their ideology with the fire from the sky. And this has a couple of implications. First of all, it hurts the credibility of the West by implementing moral autonomy, but it also hurts us in things that we're involved in, like the UN Security Council, where we need to have moral legitimacy in order to be taken seriously on a global stage. And when you attack civilians with fire from the sky, it's hard to think of you as a morally legitimate actor. Okay, no. Last idea is this sort of idea of increased technology leads to weapons, like increased weapon things. If we're using drones, other countries are going to have to start using drones too, because they have to be on equal footing with us, because as they said, there is some degree of needing equal footing. We think this is particularly bad because of the qualified military edge we give to Israel, where we have to give them drones if we continue to use that. We think it's particularly bad because Israel is probably going to be less discriminate about what they use than we are. So we think that if we get rid of it, no, that's probably better. I'll take that down.
Okay, Sergeant Robert Bales just massacred 15 innocent people. How can you possibly argue that drones are inherently worse when soldiers suffering from PTSD are now going to be the ones in the battlefield killing civilians because they're pissed off?
So, I respond to that in one way. Simply, first of all, drones kill more than 15 civilians at a time. We think that's particularly bad. We also think that if soldiers with PTSD are killing civilians, let's treat them. Let's not let them go out of the VA hospital without treatment and care. We think that if this sergeant needs to have a reaction in order to do this, we think that we should deal with that in general. Okay, now I'm going to talk about why fighting terrorism with terrorism is a bad idea. The US government has come out and said that our objective in Iraq and other places is to win hearts and minds, to seem like we are a more legitimate actor, to gain the support of the people that we're going into. This undoes that for a couple of reasons. As I've already stated, it is a technological disincentive. We're basically coming out with no face, no weapons. When you see a soldier on the ground guarding and protecting your area, rather than a drone, it means a connection to those people. You see that you are being protected by the country that's supposed to be supporting you. Whereas if you're only using drones to patrol a region, you're not going to have any connection to the army that you're trying to protect. But also, when it does attack, it will attack indiscriminately, which is particularly bad for a couple of reasons. As I've already stated, it can attack children, no, and it can also attack people who are non-combatants, which makes us look like moral enemies. But second of all, lastly, I'm going to talk about why decreased costs are particularly bad. Now, this is something that Kirat said in his speech, that if we send these into places where it's too expensive and too costly, we have to consider, do we want to be fighting or do we want to be killing in areas where we simply consider that it's too expensive and that therefore we should send in a drone to kill? We think that there is no accountability. With a drone, you can't put someone in jail for war crimes. You can't put a drone in jail for war crimes. You can't put the pilot of a drone in jail for war crimes because he's commanded by a large group of people. We think that accountability is too distributed and not direct enough. It's not one person pulling the trigger. You can't put that person in jail. So we think this is particularly bad. You're out of order because civilian collateral is higher because you can't actually see the person on the ground, but civilian collateral is also higher because you can't make judgment calls. You can't decide whether or not somebody is an actual threat or is not. You can't decide if the child holding a gun is going to fire at you or is not. So we think that's particularly bad. And so for these three reasons, because it foments anti-U.S. sentiment outside of the conflict we're in the long term, because fighting with terrorism defeats winning hearts and minds, and because the decreased costs of war make us more likely to go to war, we are proud to propose this law.
All right, thanks very much for that, John. And Brett, whenever you're ready.
Okay. The nature of asymmetric conflict demands that Western forces use their technological supremacy to satisfy their security needs. And at this point in the debate, it's important to make a distinction between what the motion says, counterinsurgency, and what government bench is talking about, state building. We don't have to support drones should be used in state building operations. In fact, it's probably a very imprudent strategy to adopt if you're trying to engage in regime change. So what are Amy and I talking about when we're defending drone strikes? We're defending things like the targeted killing of Osama bin Laden. Perhaps a drone would have been a more prudent option. We're talking about targeting insurgents in Yemen, or the use of Tomahawk cruise missiles to destroy training centers in Somalia or also in Yemen. So they have to provide a meaningful distinction between, say, a cruise missile launched from the Strait of Hormuz into the Helmand province, which is awfully, impersonal, or an F-22 dropping a smart bomb from 30,000 feet, and their solution is we're just going to put boots on the ground all the time. That's the position they've taken. So what I'm going to argue is that putting boots on the ground is actually bad for two reasons. First, it hurts our ability to kill insurgents in the first place, putting our security at risk. And second, I'm going to argue that drones actually protect civilians, clashing directly with some things that you heard. First, I have a few points of rebuttal. First point of rebuttal. He begins his speech by saying the West should be a moral arbiter, but then he tells us that the West shouldn't be a moral arbiter if it involves drones. We should only be a moral arbiter when we're using troops on the ground. So, which is it? Your opening government team said, and we shouldn't go into conflicts, or, you say, we should be a moral arbiter, we should just be using troops instead. That's a point of contention between opening government, and closing government that I think the whip ought to try and resolve. Second, soldiers are useful. Okay, I agree, that's not mutually exclusive. Maybe sometimes we should be using troops in addition to drones. It's not like we're just arguing that we're going to categorically use drones in every conflict all the time. We're saying sometimes it's a good idea, maybe in other situations it's a good idea to have troops. Okay, fair enough. If you want to protect civilians and you want boots on the ground, then okay, put boots on the ground, we're fine with that. Then he says that we violate sovereignty, yet at the same time he says we should be putting boots on the ground to violate sovereignty. So which is it? We shouldn't be violating sovereignty at all, ever, and we shouldn't be attacking insurgents, because that's a new argument. Or we should be putting boots on the ground because that's how you win hearts and minds when you do decide to violate sovereignty. Kind of bizarre. Then he says that troops hurt our image. Well, I pointed the example of Robert Bales. I'm sorry, drones don't get PTSD, and you can't catch every single person that has PTSD. Necessarily, there will be some troops who go out and massacre civilians like Robert Bales. Or when WikiLeaks came out and identified the soldiers who were talking over their radio while they used Iraqis as target practice, joking about come on man, pick up that weapon. If you touch that weapon, I'm going to mow you down. Those are the kinds of things that hurt the West a lot more than drones. When individuals outside the West see American pilots joking about all the people they're killing, that hurts an awful lot more than the use of drones, which aren't going to be speaking pejoratively about the individuals on the ground that are being unfortunately fired upon. Then he tells us there's no accountability, to which I say, hold the officers accountable. You can hold the pilot accountable. There's no reason you couldn't be able to. If you're a drone pilot in Nevada and you shoot somebody you shouldn't shoot, then fine, you should go in the brig. We're fine with that. Okay, so why does the government bench hurt our ability to go into these conflicts in the first place and meet our security needs? Well, we have to understand that asymmetric conflicts are necessarily wars of attrition, where Western liberal democracies are pitted against non-state actors. But see, democracies are at an inherent disadvantage, because support abroad, support for things like Somalia, support for things, counterinsurgency operations in Yemen, is contingent on domestic support, because we elect leaders who then make decisions about where we're going to go into. So, when you have democratic support, that democratic support is contingent on keeping our soldiers safe. Opening government pointed out that, hey, Somalia was an abject failure. Yes, it was, because the Black Hawk crashed, killed 18 people, and then American troops died. They were dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, and then we lost all support for the war, couldn't go into Somalia. Then President Bill Clinton lost the political capital to go into Rwanda, and there was a massive genocide that killed hundreds of thousands of people. Maybe if we would have had drone technology and used that as a more prudent option in Somalia, we wouldn't have had the Black Hawk Down situation. Americans would have been more supportive of the responsibility to protect, and we would have been much more comfortable going into places where we ought to go into. We think that Joseph Kony ought to be hunted down. We don't think you should send troops after him. Because
on that
what
side.
if you send troops after Joseph Kony, and then one of those troops dies, and then Americans are like, you know what,
On
that
Joseph
troop
Kony,
died,
sir.
I'm really upset. However, if we drone Joseph Kony, then no American troops die, we've killed the bad guy, we maintain domestic support, everything's kosher. Go ahead.
So you don't think it would hurt our moral legitimacy if we used drones to kill Kony and all of his children soldiers?
No, but your alternative is to use, boots on the ground. If you think Joseph Kony's a bad guy and we should hunt him, the alternative you provide is we should send in, SEAL Team 6, and we're saying we should use drones. If we should send in SEAL Team 6, and then SEAL Team 6 dies, then Americans get pissed, and they're like, we don't want our Navy SEALs in the Congolese jungle hunting down some dude that's irrelevant to me. Well, however, when you have drones, you maintain the support that's necessary to, continue hunting these individuals. We are a war-tired country, and if we're going to maintain any sort of supremacy and asymmetric conflict, we have to make sure that we're doing so in a way that's prudent and maintains domestic support. Okay, how do drones actually protect civilians? Well, what we say is that Western liberal democracies will put in huge amounts of effort to keep our soldiers safe. So say you send in SEAL Team 6 and then something goes wrong. Then we send in a rescue operation, and that rescue operation is going to kill a lot of people. You oftentimes hear that 18 American soldiers were killed in Somalia. What you don't hear is that during the rescue operation, we killed almost 350 Somali people. In an effort to save the Black Hawk that had gone down, we mowed down hundreds of people. But American sentiment didn't reach out to those individuals because Americans just frankly in that instance didn't care. However, if we use drones, then you protect civilian lives, because in the event that something goes wrong in your boots on the ground or wonderful situation, we're going to kill anyone that gets in our way when we're trying to rescue our boys. Go ahead.
Which do you think is more likely to raise sentiment? A drone that kills hundreds indiscriminately, or one in which you actually have soldiers that are in conflict?
Okay. So you're pigeonholing us into saying you have to defend the situation where there's an army of drones bombing hundreds of people. That's absurd. That's not what we're defending. I told you the situations and when in a counterinsurgency operation, we're not replacing our fleet of F-22s with drones because that's a good idea. We're saying that sometimes it might be a prudent decision to use a drone instead of SEAL Team 6. That's the position that we're defending in closing opposition because that's just a prudent, good decision. So then they ask this POI and they say, well, there's going to be this power vacuum. Even if you kill the insurgent, other people are just going to take over. To which we say a few things. We say that ideology often dies with the ideologue. And if you kill the ideologue with a drone, then you put a swift end to conflict. Several examples of this. When Muammar Gaddafi was killed, the conflict in Libya was essentially put to an end. We think the best strategy in that situation would have simply been to just send a drone after Muammar Gaddafi, kill him quickly, rather than allow hundreds and hundreds of people to die and that conflict go on. We think that maybe the West should decide to send a drone into Assad. I happen to think that if Assad were to die, he would stop ordering people to kill nigh on 9,000 people. We can't obviously go into that country and put boots on the ground. It's not a politically expedient decision. It's not politically tenable. However, what we do say is that you can use things like drones to make sure that the ideology dies with the ideologue. So because we understand when drones are actually used, because we're not state building, and because we actually think that it's a prudent decision and we want to protect our boys abroad, we're extremely proud to oppose.
All right. Thanks, Brett. And Christine, whenever you're ready.
Mr. Speaker, what I want to do for you today in this speech is summarize around in 3 main points. The first one will be called Winning Hearts and Minds, and analyzing the nature of counterinsurgencies. The second will be talking about the effect of drone use on the West, or what it means strategically. And the third will be talking about the effect of drone use on war itself, and how we change the nature of war for the worse. But before I get into that, I'm going to go through some points of rebuttal of the last speaker's speech, because I think that our bench was consistently mischaracterized. First of all, we hear there's a potential knife. Supposedly, John and I always advocate boots on the ground, whereas open government advocates no intervention at all. This is patently false. Open government said it's bad to intervene unnecessarily. What John and I told you was that drones increase the likelihood of intervening unnecessarily and bring with them unique harms that come along with that. We don't advocate boots on the ground all the time. I don't know where he got that from. The reason we think that's true is because the cost-benefit analysis fundamentally changes once you utilize drones instead of people. And we think that drones are fundamentally a worse form of intervention when compared to troops. Good, thank you. Then we hear this idea about post-traumatic stress disorder. 2 responses. A, non-unique. B, does that mean we should never fight using soldiers at all? Like, I don't understand. Change your mental evaluation to soldiers then, or something else. Then we get this argument about Somalia and how we lost political capital because of the visual impact, of like our soldiers being dragged along the ground, right? The problem with this example, Mr. Speaker, is that drones don't fulfill that kind of capacity. John came up here and told you that soldiers can fulfill dual capacities of protection and as well as offense. There's an element of strategy involved. No, thank you. That we don't think drones can fulfill on that strategic kind of level, right? Furthermore, in cases of Rwanda, what was needed in that instance was protection, not offense, which is what fundamentally drones are used for, so they wouldn't fit anyway. Then we hear about all about how we're actually going to cause more death to happen when we have a SEAL team, we need a rescue team, etc. Mr. Speaker, the fact that we consider all those risks and costs of sending a SEAL team in and the potential harms, we think that's a good thing that we consider, right? Because those risks make us more discriminatory for when we use and decide to use military action. Top half.
If you believe in fighting insurgents at all, can your side give us a way of doing it that is not just as destructive and that doesn't make us look technologically superior?
Okay, that's my crystallization where I do comparative benefits of using soldiers versus drones. Thank you. So then we think that with the idea of the fact that we consider this another cost-benefit analysis, that's fundamentally a good thing that deters us from using unnecessary military action, right? Okay. But let's go to our first point of crystallization. Kirat said this was a comparative debate. On principle, John and I believe that using drones is bad in war, but even if you buy the whole framework of comparative, we think that John outlined a lot of harms that are worse when we use drones. First of all, winning hearts and minds. Opening government told you that the nature of counterinsurgencies, no thank you, is that they hide in the population and makes them really hard to find, right? So we don't understand how drones solve for this, because clearly people are going to stay away from the big white military machine, and there's no chance of building interpersonal relations to build more networks of information and sources. They're thinking that would be conducive to military strategy, right? Then we hear this argument that there's less propaganda for counterinsurgencies to use, because there's no imagery of soldiers killing civilians, right? But we think there's two responses. A, these circumstances of killing innocent people would decrease if we use soldiers instead of drones, because it's easier to make last judgment calls and adjust for instantaneously, which drones, no thank you, don't have the capacity to do so. For example, when you're fighting in situations where people are using human shields, which is, by the way, killing them is a crime against humanity in the Rome Statute, soldiers can adjust for this, whereas drones can't, right? And then secondly, we hear this idea of the optics of civilian casualties. John brought you analysis in his last speech, no thank you, why it's actually worse to see these machines taking out civilians, because you have advanced weaponry against the helpless person, right? It creates this David and Goliath mentality that we don't think is a good thing. No, thank you. But then let's look at back half. Sorry, not back half. Let's look at the nature of counterinsurgencies. We don't think drones help because counterinsurgencies are ideologically motivated, right? Though all tools of war are limited in some aspects, we think drones are particularly bad to winning local support and preventing counterinsurgencies from building local support and recruiting based on anti-Western rhetoric. No, thank you. To the counterinsurgencies, the West no longer has a human face at all. It becomes easier to demonize and to incite against these and to increase a rhetoric of a victimized identity that we think fundamentally will be worse when it comes to strategy of fighting counterinsurgencies. I'll take your up.
Okay, so can you clarify for me when exactly are drones used? When a lone insurgent, as John said, is hidden in a compound and we can send in the Navy SEAls, or when you have an idiot on the street who has 60 children defending him or something?
Okay, I think in the prior circumstance, there's other methods we can explore to getting that person other than a drone. But for the second half, I think it's fundamentally worse if you send in a drone than using a human, because there's less biases to taking out human shields. But then let's talk about the effect on the West strategically when we use drones. We think that the fallout of civilian costs is different, no thank you, when we use drones versus soldiers. Because, as John told you, soldiers have a dual function, to potentially protect or attack, whereas drones are limited to one, right? Because when drones kill innocent people, there's no clear path to placate a population, to those who have lost their loved ones, to visual justice, and that increases the ability of the counterinsurgencies to use certain rhetoric that we don't think is good. No thank you. At least within the individual, there's a greater chance of accountability when you can actually pin this action on certain people and individuals that we think is a good thing. John also told you there's a particular harm of using a lot of drones, because with all these impacts that we mentioned so far, it endangers soldiers when we do send them in on the ground, if we ever so choose to use that option. Because it incites people against those soldiers, because they feel like there's been indiscriminate shooting on that part anyway. No thank you. But then, most importantly, John talks about how this decreases the opportunity cost of war in the eyes of the West. That's a bad thing because that leads to increased probability of violations of national sovereignty, right? That decreases our political capital to work in other areas, which is critical when we're in situations like discussing in the UN Security Council or NATO. But then third and finally, the effect of war itself and how it changes it. Even if you buy all the drone benefit arguments you're getting out of this side, right? And even if everyone else does, then we think that people are then incentivized to transform war and rely on advanced military technology, which is a fundamentally bad thing because it lowers the opportunity cost analysis of war for a lot of different actors as a whole, right? It incentivizes investing in these kinds of arms, which is a potential for a lot of other bad things that happens. So what have I told you today, Mr. Speaker? I've told you that given the unique nature of counterinsurgencies, we think that using drones is fundamentally worse because it gives them greater ground for recruiting to their cause and for building on a David versus Goliath mentality, right? We think it decreases our chances of winning hearts and minds, and we also think it's a bad move strategically compared to soldiers because there's a lot of fallouts that may happen and greater odds of civilian casualties and less ability to placate people when we do have those kinds of accidents and costs. For all those reasons, we are very, very proud to do this.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that. And I'd now invite Amy to close out the debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Everyone in this debate has recognized that warfare has changed. The types of wars that we engage in are different than they have been before. But the question remains is what is the best response? What tools do we have? How do we adjudicate their benefits and costs? And at the end of the day, are drones good or not when it comes to fighting terrorism and counterinsurgency? We think that opposition has done a far better job of advancing the idea of counterinsurgency, using specific examples of actual counterinsurgency rather than general warfare or state building. And we've been able to prove to you that drones are indeed a useful tool that ought to continue to be utilized when necessary. 2 points of crystallization. First, how will warfare change with the use of drones? Second, what best serves security? So first, how will warfare change? Because we were told that, look, we have to have soldiers because they can serve multi-purposes. They can serve dual purposes. Not only can they be offensive, they can also be defensive in nature. What we would tell you is that we're not advocating that we replace soldiers in every single context and in every single case. We think that there are certainly cases where having boots on the ground would indeed be a good thing. For example, if we are engaging in state building, we think it is important to have an actual face to match the idea of that country, and for people to be able to grasp onto that and see that there is another nation there to help them and give them aid. But we're not talking about those cases at all times. What we're talking about is counterinsurgency specifically, and it's better for particular counterinsurgency reasons in a couple of cases. First, it can be covert, which we think is absolutely necessary when we're talking about particular figures who have spent years hiding under rocks, completely staying out of all of Western intelligence and done a really good job at that. We think that when you're maintain the ability to be covert, that's important. But second, what we told you is that it's necessarily surgical. It's really hard to move a teal, even if it's just a SEAL Team 6, that's still a lot of people and a lot of guns and a lot of helicopters that you have to move, and it's very hard to do so in a way that's a proportionate response. We think that drones are particularly good at giving and delivering a proportionate response. Because what we're told, strangely from closing government, is that drones are completely indiscriminate and they're these blind bombing machines that just go around killing people willy-nilly. We don't think that that's what drones are today. Opening Opposition did a really good job describing to you how drone technology has improved really, really well, and that the visualization that drones get is far better than a troop on the ground can get in most cases. So we don't think that you have any of the harms that closing government even tried to advocate for. Next, we heard this idea that, look, war has to maintain an element of personalization. That there has to be some sort of human element attached to the machine or attached to the killing. Because apparently American people need to see the body bags coming home to actually care about the type of warfare that they're engaged in. But this completely ignores all of Brett's analysis that tells you that when the American people see body bags coming home, it stops us from fighting the good wars and the types of engagements that we actually need to be engaged in. And he gave you the example of Rwanda. When we saw soldiers in Mogadishu being dragged through the streets, we said no more civilian casualties. We will not go to Africa. We do not care about those people. We care more about our Marines. Those are the types of cases that we have. So we think that personalization isn't always a good thing. But furthermore, what we told you is that this depersonalization actually causes people to be far more rational in most cases. We can look to the WikiLeaks leak of a video where a soldier gunned down a man because he was picking up a video camera and mistaked it for an RPG. A drone that has far more advanced cameras and the ability to actually see wouldn't have made that mistake because the imaging is actually better, and that person who's sitting in Nevada isn't afraid of an RPG that's about to be launched because they're like a million miles away and they actually don't care about it. They're far better at being able to be cool-headed and rational and not have to face the threat of death. No thank you. Last, we were told that, look, warfare needs to be about hearts and minds. That needs to be what it's about. What we're saying is that there are certain cases where, yeah, maybe we shouldn't use drones. Like if we're in Iraq and we're trying to rebuild their parliament perhaps and train their police forces, yeah, we can't really do that with drones. And so it is important to have boots on the ground to preserve and to make those connections and use hearts and minds. We say, yeah, don't use drones where you need to be sending aid. Don't send in drones where you need to be sending in social workers and soldiers. We don't think that those two things are at all mutually exclusive, and government did an extremely poor job of explaining to you why they would be. Before I move on, I'll take back half.
Given that your partner so flippantly asserted that we should just go in and kill Assad, how do you think that would affect us in the international community if we just used a drone to go kill a leader of a country?
I think it would be far better than sending 1,000 or more troops on the ground, invading Syria, having mass casualties on our side, civilian casualties, and ultimately taking a lot longer for us to actually find Assad because drones are better at gathering information and moving quickly. So actually, I think in the international arena, it would be better for us to use a drone strike. All right, let's move on to the second point. Which best serves security? Because we think that there are two particular parties that we have to take into consideration when we're talking about security. First is the civilians in those countries that are living abroad. And second, Western security needs. So let's talk about the civilians, because Opening Opposition did a very excellent job of talking to you about how we absolutely need to minimize collateral damage as much as we possibly can. And drones are the best way to do this. This was absolutely uncontested up and down government bench. And if government bench is really concerned about winning hearts and minds, the best way to win hearts and minds of civilians is to not kill them. And that's probably the best way to actually garner support, is to have less deaths and more of those people around to see that you're doing good things and not killing your people. But what Brett brought to you was even more important, was the protection of civilians and helping those who actually need help and engaging in those good wars, those good conflicts, those good engagements that the U.S. ought to be involved in, that ought to be a moral arbiter, as we were told by closing government. We think, particularly the Rwanda example, once again, was a particularly good example of why we need to be able to be involved in conflicts without fighting the war-tired state of the United States. So last, let's talk about Western security needs, because once again, this goes completely unaddressed, is how Brett tells you that, look, government model hurts our ability to kill insurgency, because the United States is an extremely war-tired society, and drones help to fight that because we don't have to send in, they call it, first, they're less costly, and second, we don't have to send in as many American lives, which is a great benefit to many Americans. We diversify our ability to fight risk in many different areas at once because it doesn't make us disperse our troops across large areas of ground. And furthermore, it's very important in fighting non-state actors, those actors who have been extremely nefarious, the ideologues that have been able to hide out and that we have not been able to reach. Because we don't think that warfare will change for the worse, it will actually change for the better, and that we better serve our security needs through the use of drones in particular situations, we're extremely proud to propose.
Alright, thanks guys. Shake hands, get out of here. Come back soon. Cool. I'm going to run to the bathroom really quickly.
I'm going to turn off the camera.